I'm Dan Kirk. I'm a natural heritage biologist with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. I've been working here for about 18 years, and my responsibilities include managing our nature preserves and our natural areas on state lands. I also conduct floristic and faunal surveys, mostly of our endangered species, and I cover an area of 8 counties in northwestern Illinois.
How has the climate since 20,000 years ago changed the local flora and fauna?
Well, it was a much cooler time when the glaciers were around, so you had more conifers, that type of thing. As the glaciers started to retreat 12,000 years ago, we went into a hypsothermal period where it was much drier and hotter 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. So that became more conducive for the grasses. They have a large root system.
What was the human impact on the area's biology?
Humans are kind of a double-edged sword for the prairie landscape. The original Native Americans that were here, there weren't many, so they were able to live in harmony basically with the landscape. They used fire to clear a lot of areas. The regrowth would bring buffalo in. And if there was any type of disturbance, there was only native vegetation to recolonize. Upon European settlization in the early 1800s, they started farming the land, bringing other things with them from their native lands, Europe. When they would farm, that created an area for exotic vegetation. And then by late 1830s, with the invention of the steel plow, then they were able to farm large areas of the prairie because they couldn't get through the prairie roots with the wood plow at the time. By the 1850 to 1900, most of the prairie was gone in Illinois. Originally, we had about 22 million acres of prairie, which is about 60% of the landscape. And by the time early 1970s, we had about 2,000 acres of remnant, high quality remnant prairie left, which is about 1/10 of 1%. In the mid-1970s, Illinois conducted what's called an Illinois Natural Areas Inventory. And what they did, they went throughout the entire state looking for remnant communities. So from mid-70s to the late 70s, they did this. They found about 2,000 acres of remnant prairie. They went through and they graded these on an A to an F level. So the grade A prairies were essentially undisturbed. The grade B prairies were slightly disturbed. Those are the ones that made it on the high quality natural areas inventory list.
What is a tallgrass prairie?
A tallgrass prairie is a land dominated by grasses. In the eastern part of the prairie biome, you have the eastern tallgrass prairie, which is dominated by big bluestem Indian grass. As you go farther west, it gets drier, so you have a mixed grass, and then farther west, even drier, you have shortgrass prairie.
How do we know Goose Lake is a prairie?
You definitely know Goose Lake is a prairie because it's wide open and there should be no trees. Right now there's a lot of exotic shrubs out there. The main difference you want to look for is the reconstructed prairie around the edges and the nature preserve. The nature preserve is about 1,500 acres, which is roughly half of the state park, and it's the largest remnant prairie in Illinois. And if you look at it, there's a lot more diversity in the nature preserve. There's more root competition, so things are a little shorter. In the reconstructed prairie, the grasses tend to dominate, so they get really tall in these areas. They can be tall as 8 feet in some areas. This part right here, this is part of our reconstructed prairie out here. And as you can see, we talked about earlier about the difficulties of burning out here. Even though some of these are native, like this tall sunflower, we have some roses here. This tall sunflower makes it difficult to burn out here because it underneath there's not a lot of fuel to burn evenly. So the stems are much harder. The seeds, if we have some wind, they often catch fire and then move over to the other side.
What are some different types of prairies?
There's a number of different prairies. Prairies are generally categorized on their moisture regime and the substrate underneath. So in general, we have wet prairie, mesic prairie, and dry prairie. Here at Goose Lake, we have a mixture. We have mesic prairie and we have wet prairie. On the west side of Jugtown Road, there's a heavy influence of sand over there. There's a number of different soil orders. There's 12 of them, but here in Illinois, basically we'll deal with a couple of them. Mollisols are the prairie soils, which we have here. Alpha sols are the forest soils. Here at Goose Lake, within the mollisol group, we have wet prairie, we have mesic prairie, and we have a little bit of dry prairie. So the three different types of soil that we're going to be dealing with is based on the size of the particles, sand being the largest, silt, and then clay being the smallest. So the soil types are made up with different combinations of these three ingredients. We have a lot of wet prairie out here, so that's going to be a different type. Those are the alpha sols. You're going to have much more organic matter in those, and you're going to have more anaerobic conditions, so you don't have those drying out. You get much more organic material. The mesic prairies, those are the ones that are intermediate between wet and dry, and we have a number of those. The drier prairies are sand, and we have little bits of sand seams that run through different parts. The grasses are going to be shorter. You're going to have a few different species like little blue stem. And we also have influence from the Grand Kankakee Torrent, and those are the alluvial soils that are moved by water.
Why don't prairies have trees?
Prairies don't have trees mainly because of fire. Fire is the overriding factor that maintains the prairie. Without fire, prairies are always going to succeed to forest. We did have a number of large grazing and browsing animals, elk, bison, deer. We did have some natural fires from lightning strikes. They mainly occurred west of here. The Native Americans were the big influence with fire. They would set fire different times of the year for different effects. We tend to do prescribed burns now.
Does Goose Lake take part in controlled burns?
Mainly burning in the early spring and late fall. So we have 2 times, and that's going to influence what type of vegetation. Native Americans would often burn mid or late summer. So this is one of the spots that we may try to do a summer burn to knock back some of the big blue stem, Indian grass, and this panicum. I've had a number of fires get away, and that's due to a number of conditions. We try to keep our burns between 5 and 15 miles an hour. We don't want it completely calm, because then it may not push the fire the way we want it. And if it's too strong, then we have a big chance of it jumping and escaping to another unit and burning something up. Humidity is another thing we keep an eye on. If the humidity's too low, there's a big chance of a small ember moving to the next unit. If it's too humid, it may not get the desired effect that we want to kill shrubs. It may not burn hot enough.
Did the area ever have trees?
There were trees in the area. These trees were generally in around some of the wetter areas, the sedge meadows, the marshes. When fires came through, they would hit the wet areas, and then they would go out. Along major streams or rivers, fires couldn't cross there, so you had a number of trees in that area. A lot was wide open prairie as far as you could see, but then there were other areas that you had scattered open savannas where you would just have a few trees per acre.
What is a weed?
A weed is a plant out of place. In my world, if it's a non-native species, it's a weed. If you have something growing around your house that you don't want, whether it be native or not, then it's going to be a weed. So it all depends on your point of view. This is wild quinine. This is a pretty typical prairie plant. That's one of the ones we want to see. This is ashy sunflower, another nice native plant. And then we have gray-headed coneflower. This isn't as conservative as the other two, but still native. This is one of the native thistles. It can get pretty aggressive in some areas. And then we have back here, this is goldenrod. This is a native species, but it's disturbance dependent.